Hello, welcome to another video. Today I'm going to show you how I painted my Great Unclean One. This is easily one of my favorite models that I've painted so far, and with this video I'm going to share with you how I painted him and hopefully give you some ideas and a potential approach on how to paint your own Great Unclean One. There are many different ways that you could paint this guy, but in this video I'm going to be focusing primarily on layering. So with that, there's a lot to get through. Let's get into it. First up, I'm going to show you how to paint the skin. This is the color palette that I'm going to be using. I also started from a black primer, so I had a nice dark color to build my layers from. First up, I wanted to alter the color of my deepest shadows, and the color I chose was a mixture of blue and purple. This is going to create a nice cool tone that I can put in the shadows and layer on top of, and it's going to interact interestingly with my greens and yellows to create some nice looking skin at the end. With that base coat down, I then took flat green and then dry brushed this on the raised areas on the model. Now during this dry brush step, I'm imagining the model as a ball, and I'm trying to dry brush this on the areas of the model that would be catching the most light. And this is going to be my guide for my layering in the next step. Before we get further, let's talk about thinning paints because we're going to be doing a lot of glazing in this video. First up, you're going to need a damp brush. I like to dip mine in a water cup and then roll this on a paper towel. This will dampen both the paper towel and the brush. The paper towel is going to be used to remove excess moisture from the brush. If it's too dry, it might remove too much moisture. When you put the paint directly onto the wet palette, it's going to look something like this. And you can see if I take some with the tip of my brush, it's going to be quite thick. This is the thickest the paint should be. If your brush is slightly damp, it should slightly thin down this paint when you mix it onto the palette. Use the damp paper towel to remove excess moisture from the brush, and then what you'll see is when you paint this on the model, the paint is going to have pretty strong coverage. You can see this when I paint it on my thumb. For glaze consistency paints, you just have to thin the paint with a little dab of water. I like to take the water from a water droplet on my palette and mix it into the paint. If there's no water droplet, I just dip the tip of my brush in my water cup. When the paint separates on the palette, then you know that the paint is thinned. To remove excess moisture, tap the brush on a paper towel, but don't remove all the moisture because glazes need some level of moisture so that the paint flows smoothly off the brush. When painting this on my thumb, you can see the color on my skin underneath the layer. This is the consistency of paint that I use for the majority of the time when painting the skin on the Great Unclean One. So with that, let's jump back into it. For the first layer on the skin, I use Ogren Camo. This is slightly thinned down with a tiny bit of water, and I'm using a size 5 synthetic brush here with a sharp tip because the model is so large. For this step, I'm focusing on adding the color on top of the raised folds on the skin. However, more importantly, I'm looking at the model as a sphere and trying to imagine where the model is catching light, and I'm focusing on introducing this color into those light catching sections. For example, on top of the belly, I'm not just painting the color on top of the folds, I'm also painting the color in the recesses because in that section, even those recesses would catch some light. My thought process is that this Ogren camo color is going to be the base skin tone of the model, and I want any section on the model that catches light to have some of this color in it, while my darkest shadow color is going to be closer to that original dark purple base coat. Be sure to let your paint completely dry between layers, or the paint may not dry completely smooth. Now this model has a lot of skin to cover, and I actually moved on to the next steps before finishing this layer on the entire model. If you're like me and do this, you can always come back to this color and repeat the steps for painting the skin on those other sections separately. This approach made the model a little more manageable for me. The next layer, I mixed my flat green and Ogren camo at a glaze consistency and used this to smooth the transitions between the Ogren green and the dark sections. I'm focusing this color in the folds of the skin and basically anywhere the Ogren camo touches the darker sections. For this layer, I try to avoid the deepest recesses though, to keep them that darker purple color. After that, I then move on to my next highlight color, which is Kislev Flesh. For this layer, I focused on the sections that are going to catch the most light, and just like the previous two layers, I'm using thin coats so I can build up the color little by little. I'm also trying my best to follow the contours of the skin. The thought process behind using this color is that I wanted the skin to have a more natural looking skin tone instead of a very vibrant green color. After that, I moved on to a darker shade using refractive green, and I put this right into the recesses. For the most shaded areas like under the arms and under the belly, I painted this on thinly so that the deeper shadows remain that dark purple color. After adding that shade, I then moved up to an even brighter highlight color by mixing ivory white and auburn camo, and then I painted this on the most light catching sections of the skin. For this step, I also did quite a few of the finer highlights like here on the feet and toes. This helps make the details on the model more readable. And that pretty much captures my approach for painting the skin. Just to recap, step one was to use Auburn Camo for the base skin tone. Step two is to shade using flat green. Step three is to add brighter highlights of Kislev Flesh. Step four is to blend in the layers again with refractive green and flat green. Step six is to add even brighter highlights of Auburn Camo mixed with white. And then, of course, blend the transitions to make them smooth. I would say the most important part of this process is patience and observation. But if you're like me and run out of patience, you can always move on to the next steps and come back later and finish the skin. And moving on, the next thing I did was paint the fleshy areas. I kept these really simple. I just did base coat, shade, highlight, starting with the mouth here. For this, I'm using flat flesh and base coating the lips. Because we're using washes, try to go for solid coverage. This right here took me about 2 coats. I also took this same flat flesh color and painted this around the torn flesh sections on the body. Next up, I applied my wash. In this case, I used Juki Violet. Keep your brush moving, make sure to remove excess pooling, and then make sure you let it dry for at least 15 minutes. On the torn flesh sections, I do the exact same thing. After letting the Druki Violet dry, I then took my Ogren Camo and then used that to blend in the purple color into the pallid green flesh. Now I'm using a very thin glaze paint here to smooth these transitions. To finish up these torn sections, I then added another layer of Druki Violet, but this time only into the deepest recesses. I also added some fine highlights on the lips using Kislev Flesh. I had recorded this, but my footage got corrupted. And now for the mustard sections. For the base coat, I'm using ochre brown. Now this color does not have the best coverage over black, so I found if you use tan as an undercoat, it'll cover a lot easier. After getting a solid base coat, I then wash these areas with Druki Violet. And after the wash comes the highlight. For the highlight layer, I'm using yellow ochre at a base coat consistency and edge highlighting all of these yummy details inside these mustard sections to make sure they stand out. For the final highlight, I then take pure ivory white and add some very fine spot highlights. And this is supposed to make it look like it's a little bit wet. Next up, the other form of gross bit is the fleshy parts. For this, I do the same tactic, but this time I'm using magenta as my base coat. This magenta is literally a mixture of red and purple. And just like the mustard sections, I use Druki Violet again for the wash. After letting the Druki Violet completely dry, I then go back with my magenta color and add some quick highlights. And for the final step, I use ivory white to add some line highlights to these gooey sections. Now that's it for those sections. Now I'm going to show you how I painted the horns. So starting from a black primer, I took whole red, which is basically a reddish brown color, and then painted the upper 2/3 of each horn. After that, I then took a mixture of black and whole red and painted this on the upper sections of each horn to try to create this transition from the brown to a darker brown color. Next, I used Iraqi sand and painted this on the lower section of the horn. I'm using a glaze consistency paint here so I can build up the color little by little so I can create a smooth transition from the brown to the tan. After that, I then take a wash of Agarex Earthshade and wash the entire horns. This is going to bring out the detail while also helping blend in those transitions to make the horns look like they're transitioning from this bright ivory color to a dark brown at the tips. The last step was to take my Iraqi sand color and then edge highlight these horns. And that's how I painted the horns. Painting the highlights on these was really frustrating, but I think they turned out looking really good. I also repeated these steps on the teeth. And next up, I'm going to show you how I painted the weapons. Starting from a black primer, I first painted the trim using Balthazar Gold. Now when working with Balthazar Gold, I don't add any water to the paint. I just take the paint, put it on my wet palette, and then use it from there. After finishing up the trim, I then just mixed in a tiny bit of black into my Stormhost Silver and then painted the rest of the sword. Again, I'm not thinning down these paints, I'm just using base coat consistencies. After getting the base coat down, I just added a wash of Agrax Earthshade. So with the wash dried, now we have a perfect base to add some other colors. So the first color is Temple Guard Blue. Now, the important thing here is that I water this paint down to a little bit thinner than a glaze consistency, and then I dab this on the bronze sections, and I'm focusing this paint in the recesses and in the cracks. I want it to flow into those cracks so that when it dries, it looks like oxidization. I repeat this again, this time using Baroth Blue, which is just a slightly brighter Temple Guard Blue. Now for the rust effects, I literally just mix orange and whole red, and then I use that same watered down paint consistency and just dab this randomly along the sword blade. After the layer dries, I then add an additional layer, but this time I mix in a little bit more orange and then add some more highlights. For the final step, I highlight the blade with pure Stormhost Silver, and that wraps up how I painted the weapons. I repeated this step on all of the weapons, and I think they turned out really cool. This doesn't involve any fancy effect paints, this is just regular paints, and these are some of my favorite weapons that I've ever painted. Now, as they say, a model is not complete until it's based, so let's talk about that. For the basing, I wanted to put this guy on a big rock so he's extra elevated and imposing on the tabletop. For the rock, I used a big piece of cork. This cork actually comes from a cork coaster that you can get from IKEA. To measure out the size of the cork that I needed to cut, I just used a marker and sketched out a circle around the Great Unclean One. After that, I then just tore off chunks of cork until I was happy with the shape. After getting the rock, I then test fitted the model. I should have marked where to put the feet because later I ended up putting the model on backwards, which was a little annoying. I then colored the cork with black primer. The reason why I went for primer instead of paint is because cork is really spongy, and I've found that if you use paint, the paint tends to soak into the cork instead of sitting on top of the cork, which is what I wanted to do. After that, it was just a matter of gluing the cork down. For this, I use E6000. Now again, I should have marked where to put this because I ended up gluing this on backwards. It was then time to add some highlights and color using dry brushing. For the first color, I mixed black and brown apple barrel paint and then dry brushed this all over the rock. I then dry brushed on lighter and lighter layers by mixing in more gray into the mixture. This was just to bring out the edge of the rock and define the shape of the base. And there we go. That's one good looking rock. Next up, I then apply a goopy texture paste all around the base to create this nice toxic green effect. After that, I then paint this goopy texture paste to make it look extra cool. Now, I have a separate video on how I do this, so if you want to see how I do bases like this, be sure to check out that video. And after that, it was just a matter of super gluing the Great Unclean One onto his rightful throne. Now, the thing here is when you super glue this model on, you have a very short amount of time to make sure he's positioned correctly. So make sure that you pre-test fit him before you do this. And that's pretty much how I painted this Great Unclean One. There are other sections that I didn't show in this video, like the smoke on the flail and the skulls in this arm, but if I included every detail, I think that this video would get way too long, so I opted to just include the main parts of this model. At this point in the video, I actually was not completely done painting this guy. In fact, at the time of recording this video, I'm still finding things to touch up and refine on this model. It feels endless to me because of the sheer size and detail. I mean, look at this tiny little bell. That thing was so easy to miss. Even though I'm still working on him here and there, I would say that this model is done and ready for the tabletop. And in my opinion, done is better than perfect, which is also how you know I'm not an Emperor's Children guy. Hope that this video encourages you to tackle this guy. The Great Unclean One really feels like a Dark Souls boss of miniature painting to me. He's so detailed and intimidating, but if you take him on with a plan and chip away at him little by little, you'll be able to get him done and looking amazing for the tabletop. If you like the video, like and subscribe. I really appreciate it, and it helps motivate me to paint more and make more YouTube videos. I'm almost at 1,000 subscribers, and I can't thank you guys enough. Hope to see you in the comment section, and peace out.